Ivan Andreevich Belov, known locally only as Raven, sat by the dying fire in the winter hut, which had ceased to be anyone's home 20 years ago, when the last miner did not return from the spring flood. The cracked logs smelled of smoke, cedar resin, and thyme. And through the cracks in one of the corners, the sparse, greyish light of a short autumn day penetrated, illuminating the simple life of a man who had voluntarily removed himself from the city registry. On Voron's knees, curled up in a tight black ball, lay Shadow, his Laika, his companion, and in fact the only creature who did not try to unravel his silence or disturb his carefully guarded solitude. Her full name was Shadow of the Taiga, but Raven called her simply Shadow, and this name reflected her essence. She was silent, always nearby, and an integral part of his existence, like a second, sharper gaze directed at the wild, wary world. Outwardly, Raven was a simple and unremarkable man. Short, wiry, with a hard, weather-beaten face, whose wrinkles were not carved by age, but by endless gazing at the horizon, and by sunburn, and then frostbite. But his eyes, light grey, almost colourless, seemed unusually deep and penetrating, constantly scanning the space, and there was always something in them that could not be relaxed, either the alertness of a predator or the endless, quiet sadness of an observer.
He was a freelance consultant, an unofficial expert on everything related to the taiga, from searching for lost hunters to evaluating disputed gold-bearing areas. But most often, he was called in on cases that the city folks, police officers from the regional center, who worked according to manuals written for asphalt, called hopeless, and he simply called unread. The silence that Voron valued above all else was broken by the dull, strained roar of an engine clearly not suited to the broken forest roads, followed by a sharp, irritated honk that echoed through the gorge. The Shadow instantly raised its head, lifting its black body from its master's knees for a second, and let out a low, guttural growl that was more like a warning than a bark. The Raven only raised an eyebrow slightly, without changing his posture or taking his eyes off the knife blade, which he was now slowly and meditatively sharpening with a whetstone, listening to the whisper-like squeak of steel and allowing the sounds of approaching civilization to simply disappear into his consciousness as meaningless noises. But he knew it was for him, and he knew it was urgent. Otherwise, no one would risk driving an old government-issued loaf across such rough terrain. A few minutes later, a silhouette appeared in the doorway of the winter hut, which had no door and was covered only by an old canvas curtain. It was a young, tall operative from the local branch, a lieutenant named Anton Ryabinin. His clean city uniform, despite attempts to make it look like field attire, was covered in mud and caught on thorny bushes, and his eyes darted with fear and poorly concealed arrogance, the usual mixture of feelings that city professionals experienced when meeting Voron. They despised his methods based on intuition, reading tracks, and knowledge of the taiga rather than protocol. But they were terrified of it and knew perfectly well that only Raven could solve their problems in this wild, unyielding realm.
Voron, Ryabinin began, panting from walking so fast and probably from fear of the sullen owner of the hut. You need to go, urgently. They found a body. You see, it's not an accident. It's Karpov. The name Karpov instantly pierced the atmosphere of calm. Ivan Karpov was the kind of man who, like a cancerous tumor, spread to any place, even the wildest. Known for his greed and lack of principles, he owned several large gold mining sites,
but became famous for methodically and ruthlessly squeezing out small cooperatives and individual prospectors, using his connections and pure undisguised force.
Voron, without looking up, continued to sharpen his knife. And this silence was heavier than any refusal.
He was one of those people who would be better off not existing. Ryabinin continued, realizing that simple threats had no effect on this man. But there, at the scene, it's just hell. No traces. As if he fell off the cliff himself. But someone prepared him. This is our only chance, Raven. The governor has already called our superiors 3 times. Only then did Voron slowly put away the bar, running his thumb along the sharp blade, which glinted faintly in the dim light. And this quiet, focused gesture spoke louder than a long speech. He nodded, and Shadow, understanding the command, jumped to the floor in one leap, ready to move. The crime scene was an hour-and-a-half's drive and a 10-minute walk from the nearest relatively passable section of road. On the edge of one of the old Karpov mines, which, according to rumors, had been taken from the family of the deceased. Prospector. For a pittance, the place itself was the embodiment of destruction. Fresh, loosened earth, hastily cut down trees, deep ruts from heavy equipment, which had turned the once lively part of the Taiga into a dirty, dreary mess.
Karpov was found at the foot of a small but steep clay cliff. And at first glance, the scene appeared to be the result of an accidental fall, exacerbated by poor visibility or slippery ground. The entire team, including the forensic experts, stood around like cows in a swamp, not knowing how to approach the problem. Their attention was focused on the body. Drag marks, numerous bruises indicating that Karpov had either been thrown or had fallen during a struggle. And then someone had made an effort to make it look as natural as possible for the wild terrain. For the city folks, it was a dead end. The soil was too loose. The shoe prints were numerous and indistinguishable. The weather conditions, recent like rain, had washed away most of the potential evidence, and the personal belongings scattered around seemed to have been hastily staged. The Raven did not approach the body. He knew that the forensic experts had already trampled everything they could and left him only with spoiled material. He moved around the perimeter, not looking at his feet, but carefully examining everything above eye level. The Shadow walked ahead, not descending into the pit where the body lay, but skirting around it. Its movements precise and purposeful, like the movements of a black wind. The Raven wasn't looking for fingerprints, shell casings or DNA traces, which were necessary for reports. He was looking for language, the language of a tracker, a hound, a predator who always leaves something behind, even when striving for complete invisibility. Karpov was killed by a man who didn't just want to eliminate him, but wanted to send a message. This was evident from the deliberate, almost theatrical staging of the scene. This is not how a mercenary who is simply doing a job acts, but how a man who enjoys his superiority acts. The death was brutal, but there was no blind rage in it, only cold, calculated judgment. Voron walked around the mine in a wide arc, ignoring the calls of Lieutenant Ryabinin, who was nervously pacing and demanding that the consultant look at the tracks allegedly left by Karpov at the edge of the cliff. He stopped at the place where a strip of untouched spruce forest began, contrasting sharply with the ravaged mining land, and where stood a single giant, incredibly old cedar tree, which Karpov had apparently been afraid to cut down because of its impressive size, or because of superstition. The Shadow froze, its nose pressed against the trunk, its tail hanging down, a sign that it had smelled something that was not the usual scent of the forest.
but was not a threat either. The raven slowly approached the cedar and placed its palm on its rough, time-worn bark. He wasn't looking for a fresh cut or a break. He was looking for something that at first glance would be mistaken for an old hunting mark, a property line, or the work of a clumsy lumberjack. At shoulder level, half covered with moss and darkened by rain, was a carving. It was not a simple notch indicating direction, or 3 parallel lines, the standard mark for a campsite. It was a complex, multi-part symbol, something like an ancient petroglyph, an imitation of a hunting mark that had been used by his grandfather to convey information between clans, but which had been almost completely forgotten. Raven ran his fingers along the carved line, feeling its perfect depth and precise, confident slope. There was no rush here. There was ritual. The symbol consisted of 3 key elements: an inverted Latin letter V, symbolizing a trap or a dead end, which was crossed out at the bottom by a double wavy line, a sign of excess, dishonest profit, or destroyed balance. And the third most important element, in the very center, at the intersection of the lines, was a small, almost invisible dot, made so delicately that it could easily be mistaken for an insect's mark. This dot was a signature, a personal code that in the language of ancient Taiga philosophy meant master or supreme predator. Raven understood. This was not just a murder. It was a message addressed specifically to him. The killer knew that within a radius of hundreds of kilometers, only one person, Voron, would be able to not only see this mark, but also read it. His own unspoken code, according to which the Taiga itself passes judgment on those who destroy it, had been used against him. The killer declared that Karpov was a sick individual who had disrupted the natural balance, and he, the master, took it upon himself to restore that balance. It felt as if a heavy, sharp stone had been thrown into the quiet, sleepy pool of his loneliness. It was not fear. It was a deep, primal indignation. Raven looked up, where the branches of the cedar tree, like giant paws, hid in the gray sky, and felt the tension tighten his jaw muscles. Someone who thinks like him, but who has crossed the line. The line between philosophy and murder, between observation and action. And that someone had decided to challenge him, to draw him into a game that Raven had not asked for and did not want, but which he now could not refuse. The game had begun, and it was not written on paper, but carved into a living old tree in the heart of the wild taiga. He already knew that the police would overlook this mark, record the death as a possible crime motivated by personal animosity, or an accident with elements of criminality, and get bogged down in meaningless bureaucracy. But one thing was now clear to Voron. A new, dangerous predator had appeared in the taiga, one who considered him his only worthy opponent. And he had just made his first move. Voron slowly turned his back on the cedar without saying a word, and moved back to where an irritated Ryabinin was waiting for him. The shadow followed him, stepping silently on the damp moss. And the owner sensed in its movements the same thing he himself felt, an impatient anticipation of the hunt. The raven left the bustling operatives, detectives, and Lieutenant Ryabinin at Karpov's mine, without saying a single word that could be recorded in the minutes, and without looking at the corpse. He didn't need any urban evidence. No fingerprints, no soil samples, not even an official medical examiner's report. He took everything he needed with him, in his memory, in the feeling of the damp moss on the cedar trunk, in the faint scent that the shadow caught at the foot of the ancient tree. And most importantly, in the cold, mathematically precise carving. That had become a message. On the way back, while the old loaf shook over the potholes, Raven sat in silence, which Ryabinin, out of habit, took for sullenness or unwillingness to cooperate. But in fact, it was a deep, concentrated immersion into someone else's mind. He was mentally replaying the scene of the murder, but not as an investigator, but as another predator, reconstructing the logic of the attack. The escape route, the choice of location, the tool used to make the mark, and, most importantly, why the cedar, which had always been considered a sacred tree by local peoples, had been chosen as the canvas for this barbaric but meaningful code. Returning to the winter hut, he lit the stove, and the crackling of dry wood became the only sound he allowed at that moment. The shadow, unerringly sensing its master's inner tension, lay down at his feet, curling up tighter than usual, becoming his unspoken, silent anchor. The raven spread a sheet of blank paper on a roughly knocked-together table, and taking a simple pencil, began to slowly and carefully transfer the three elements of the forest code from the cedar bark. An inverted Latin V, a double wavy line beneath it, crossing its base. And finally, that very same jeweler's dot notch at the center of the intersection. To a city dweller, it would have been just a series of random scratches, perhaps someone's failed experiment or an ancient hunting mark. But for Raven, who grew up in this language of the Taiga, where every broken paddle, every mark on a stone, every special arrangement of brushwood carried information about wealth, poverty, illness, or death, it was a clear, grammatically correct sentence. He began deciphering, not as a linguist, but as a translator from one language of nature to another, more dangerous, human language. An inverted V is a symbol that in ancient hunting signs meant pen, trap, or end of the road. It was not just an indication of death, but an indication of the manner of death that had been arranged. The double wavy line crossing the pen in turn was a sign of water, wealth, gold. But in this context, where it crossed the path, it meant excess, pollution, or unfair profit. Combining the first two elements, Voron came up with the phrase, a trap, for those who live in excess, who have polluted wealth.
This was a direct, unambiguous statement of motive. Karpov was killed not out of revenge or conflict, but for violating some higher, natural law.
He was punished for his greed, for his cancerous tumor on the body of the Taiga, about which Ryabinin spoke with involuntary relief. And here lay the main truth that disturbed Voron. The killer's philosophy, his reasoning, was strangely close to his own code. Voron had professed all his life the principle that the Taiga itself rejects sick individuals, those who take more than they need, who kill for vanity, who violate the unwritten balance. He himself was, in essence, the guardian of this balance, using his knowledge to minimize the damage caused by the destructive influence of civilization.
But he never took it upon himself to execute anyone. He merely watched as nature, like a wise, slow-moving executioner, caught up with the violators. The third element, that barely noticeable but perfectly precise dot, carried the strongest charge.
It was a personal signature, an autograph which, as Voron knew very well, in the old Taiga signs meant the one who watches from above, the one who passes judgment, or, more accurately, in this contextual interpretation, the master. It wasn't. just bragging. It was an act of defiance. The killer wasn't hiding. He was proudly declaring his status. He didn't just kill Karpov. He carried out an exemplary execution and left his name, knowing that only one person would read it. The message was not a threat, but an assertion of superiority, a declaration of war addressed directly to Voron. I do your job, but I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. I am the master, and you are just Voron, the watchman. The anger that rose in Voron was heavy, like cold lead, and completely alien to his usual stoic composure. It was not fear for his own life, but the anger of a man whose most cherished beliefs had been stolen, twisted, and used as justification for a sadistic, calculated hunt. The killer acted according to his philosophy, but crossed that invisible but absolute line that separated natural selection from human conscious murder. The Raven had always believed that human life was a separate category, not subject to his personal judgment, that even a sick individual should be banished, but not destroyed by his hand. This master, on the contrary, enjoyed the process, savoring his power, and this feeling of superiority, which was evident in the perfect geometry of the mark, was disgusting. The Raven realized that the killer was not simply restoring balance. He was imitating it, using a noble idea as a screen to satisfy his dark instincts. If the Raven sought justice, then this master undoubtedly sought pleasure. It was not a philosophy, but a game, in which Karpov was only the first pawn. And now, having left the mark, the master invited the main player, Raven, to this deadly game. He saw Raven as his only worthy opponent, a man who could read his language, understand his logic, and appreciate his skill. It was the ultimate insult, an encroachment on Raven's territory. He slowly pushed aside the pencilum paper on which the code was encrypted and picked up his old, trusty knife again. Now his movements were not meditative, but purposeful, filled with cold determination. The question Ryabinin had asked him, "You understand this is not an accident," now sounded different in Raven's head. You understand, this is not just murder, it's a challenge. Yes, he understood, and he couldn't let it go. Not for the sake of the law, not for the sake of the police, but for himself and his code. This master had encroached on his territory, on his ideas of justice, turning them into a bloody farce. Voron stood up. His decision was made without hesitation, without moralizing, and without doubt. He had to stop this man, because if the master continued to act under the guise of natural justice, he would desecrate the very idea that Voron considered the basis of his existence in the Taiga. He had to prove to the master that the true guardian of balance does not become an executioner for pleasure. The killer had crossed the line, and now Raven had to not only find him, but catch him in the mistake of his self-confident, twisted logic. He began to pack his backpack. A small supply of food, a spare compass, an axe, ammunition, and, of course, tools for reading tracks. Binoculars, a magnifying glass, a notebook. The shadow, as if reading his thoughts, did not make a sound, but her body tensed, ready for a long, exhausting journey. The tension in Voron, which he could feel, was like the pulling of a bowstring. It was sharp, painful, but necessary for an accurate, inevitable shot. He left the winter hut, which was once again plunged into darkness and silence, and headed for the old police station that Ryabinin had left at the fork in the road. He would not work with the police. He would use them as a screen, as cover, until he read the master's next move. And he knew that this next move would not be long in coming. A predator who is being met with a challenge always speeds up the game, seeking to prove its absolute superiority. The Raven was ready. He knew he was entering a psychological duel, a game where not only his life was at stake, but also the honor of that very unspoken code he had kept within himself for many years. From now on, he was no longer a consultant, but prey, which, however, could unexpectedly turn into the most dangerous hunter. Ryabinin, having left the patrol and detectives at Karpov's mine, returned for Raven 2 hours later. He expected to find him packing, ready for action, or at least at the table with a map and pencil, but found Ivan Andreevich in the same place, sitting by the stove with a completely calm, almost serene expression on his face. This calmness was far more disturbing to the lieutenant than open aggression. He felt that Voron already knew what the police would not learn even after a week of work, but his knowledge was completely useless because it existed outside the protocol, outside the criminal code, and outside the jurisdiction of the investigation. The police were at a dead end, and Ryabinin, a young, ambitious man who was used to databases and video cameras in the city, did not know how to deal with a murder committed in an area where nature was the main witness and accomplice. Ivan Andreevich, Ryabinin began immediately, without the usual preliminaries, his voice tense with despair. Our boss has given me complete carte blanche. We are ready to listen. What did you see? A mark? Did you decipher it? Voron, without taking his eyes off the fire, nodded slightly. A message, he corrected in a quiet, muffled voice. The lieutenant instantly leaned forward, expecting a clear name, address, or at least the name of the murder weapon. It's a challenge, a game. The master. He decided that Karpov was a sick individual who had upset the balance. He executed him and left me his autograph. Ryabinin felt the tension inside him give way to confusion and irritation. The master? An autograph? Ivan Andreevich, this isn't a thriller. We need facts. DNA, fingerprints, a motive that can be entered into a criminal case, not Taiga philosophy. We can't start a search based on some psycho who thinks he's the master of the Taiga. Voron finally raised his light grey, faded eyes to him. There was no contempt in that look, only a weary acceptance of the inevitable. Your method. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack when all the hay has already been raked through 10 times. You're looking for what he lost. I'm looking for what he's said. You wait for your machines in the city to tell you where to look. I go where he told me to go. He waved his hand, pointing to the cracked table. He left no fingerprints. His tracks are indistinguishable from those of a hunter. He left without looking back. Everything you find will either be a coincidence or a false lead he left to distract people like you. I'll work according to his language. You'll work according to protocol. Ryabinin felt offended, but quickly suppressed it, realizing that he was powerless in this wilderness. But you understand that we have to find him. If he feels so unpunished, there will be others. He has your philosophy if you don't stop him. There will be others. Voron repeated dryly, his voice sounding like steel. That's exactly why I'm going to stop him. But not according to your protocol.
According to his, I'll show him that there is only one master in this game. And it's not the one who kills to prove his superiority. He began to gather his equipment. At that moment, the conversation was over, and the lieutenant realized that he could either follow Raven, trying at least to record his actions, or leave with nothing. He chose the former.
The next 3 days turned into an exhausting, humiliating ordeal for Ryabinin.
Raven moved through the taiga slowly, but with incredible determination, as if he wasn't searching, but knew exactly where to go.
They did not follow trails, but rather the barely discernible curves of the terrain,
avoiding areas where an ordinary person might tread.
Voron led them through the most difficult places, through windbreaks, over rocky scree, and the long streams with uneven bottoms.
He moved as if he were part of the landscape, without breaking branches or making unnecessary sounds.
And his black like a dog, Shadow, was his perfect echo. Ryabinin, despite all his athletic training, constantly stumbled and made noise, and his expensive but impractical city clothes got caught on bushes, giving him away. Voron wasn't looking for shoe prints.
He was looking for a psychological portrait of the killer. He read how the master moved.
He didn't rush, Raven commented quietly, without emotion, as they made their way through the thick raspberry bushes, where Ryabinin would have left dozens of footprints. See, the branches are pushed aside, not up, carefully, without breaking them. This is not fatigue. It is the habit of a man who does not want to leave traces, even if no one is chasing him. He enjoys his invisibility. Superiority. They came out onto an old, abandoned geological exploration site. Raven stopped.
He's not local.
Look at his choice of route. He walks beautifully, but inefficiently. A local would have gone around the ravine, but he took the most beautiful, yet dangerous edge. He wanted to test himself, to show what he could do. A rich man who can buy himself any toy, including knowledge, but cannot buy the innate instinct of a taiga dweller. Voron recreated the image of the master, as if painting him with invisible colors on the canvas of the taiga. Cool-headed, experienced in the wild, as evidenced by his ability to camouflage campsites and choose the most difficult routes, but at the same time, incredibly rich, as evidenced by the traces of expensive, functional, but not local equipment, which he could notice almost by the color of the scuffs on the stones. He acted out of a sense of absolute superiority, feeling like a master of fate, a man who stood above ordinary laws. He was a sadist who didn't just kill, but played. And this game was addressed personally to Voron.
On the third day, they reached a small, almost dry waterfall in a mountain gorge that served as a natural barrier to anyone trying to pass to the west.
Here, on a smooth, water-washed boulder that was too heavy for one person to move, Raven found the second clue.
It was not carved like the first one, but was applied with a special mixture of resin and crushed berries, imitating the color of an ancient petroglyph, but not erased by dew and wind.
It was an imitation of an ancient hunting sign that Raven remembered from children's books and his grandfather's lessons. A sign for beast with a big head, or trophy. The symbol was the outline of horns forming a triangle, and at the bottom, this
Triangle was crossed out, with 3 thick vertical lines, meaning blood, law, or triply punished. The interpretation was instantaneous and terrifying.
trophy, horns. This pointed to a poacher, but not an ordinary one who kills for food,
but one who deliberately exterminates rare animals for expensive trophies, for horns that can be sold on the black market for huge sums of money. The name came to Voron's mind as quickly as Shadow would react to the smell of an elk. Victor Stupin. He was widely known in narrow circles as a supplier of the most expensive antlers and horns, killing 3 or 4 rare morals per season. The master sent him a second message, and it was even more boastful than the first.
He didn't just point out the next victim. He justified his choice using the same language of natural justice. Stupin was a sick individual who was destroying the balance for money. The owner deliberately gave Voron a head start, but it was too short for him to catch up. He wanted Raven to come. He wanted Raven to see his work and appreciate it. Raven felt his anger give way to a cold, calculating obsession.
This man was not just a killer. He was a psychologist who played on his deepest convictions. Ryabinin, whom Raven finally allowed to approach the rock, looked at the tar stain in complete bewilderment.
Ivan Andreevich, this is just dirt.
What victim? We have no reports of missing poachers. We will, Raven replied curtly, already descending into the streambed. A trophy. Stupin. He should have been here 2 days ago, driving the marrels into the lowlands. The master had time.
I'm going on. Follow me if you want the police to be at least close to solving the case. Voron knew there was no time. The master doesn't wait. He's always one step ahead. And at that moment, Raven ceased to be a consultant. He became a hunter who had accepted the challenge. But this hunt was like walking on a knife's edge, because each deciphered mark brought him closer, not only to the master, but also to being accused of complicity in this bloody, philosophical game.
The last thing he heard was Ryabinin's desperate but powerless cry. I can't just go like this. I need a warrant. I need a plan.
But the Raven was already far away. His only plan was the shadow, his instinct, and the knowledge that the next mark would be even more difficult, even more sophisticated, because the game was just beginning. And it had to be worthy of the only 2 true predators in this vast, indifferent taiga.
Stupin, the poacher whose name Raven had deciphered from a mixture of resin and berries, turned out to be closer than he would have liked for several days. The chase, which began in the mountain gorge where the trophy sign was found, was an exhausting but pointless race against time, which Raven, with his many years of experience, knew he had lost.
The master gave him a head start, enough to identify the victim, but too short to save him. They discovered a place that Raven immediately christened Golden Pen, after the trap that Stupin had fallen into, a section of an old, inaccessible trail along which the poacher had apparently driven the weakened moral to the slaughter site.
The place was remote, surrounded by dense cedar trees, where light never penetrated to the ground. And it was cold there, even when the sun was high in the sky.
Voron was not looking for Stupin. He was looking for his handwriting. And that handwriting turned out to be brutally eloquent.
The poacher's body was found not just dead, it was immobilized, caught in a trap that could only have been created by someone whose knowledge of the Taiga was equal to, and perhaps even surpassed, that of the Raven himself. The trap was not an ordinary snare, but a complex structure made of flexible but incredibly strong young birch trees, stretched and secured in such a way that when the central stone, masking the trigger mechanism, was displaced, the victim was
Instantly suspended upside down.
Stupin, walking along the path and probably losing his vigilance, stepped on the trigger plate, and the blow was so strong and unexpected
that it broke his shin, and then, under the weight of his own body, the poacher was pulled into the air, and
Being down. Death came not from the trap, but from the cold. And, judging by the expression on his face, from the complete, absolute awareness of his helplessness and inevitable doom after many hours of torment. Ryabinin, breathing heavily after the chase, stopped dead in his tracks. His urban consciousness refused to accept what he had seen. This was not murder, but the perfect, cold-blooded execution of a sentence. Using knowledge of the mechanics of nature, he reached for his radio, his fingers trembling as he prepared to call for help, which would arrive in many hours. The raven, as before, did not look at the victim. His gaze was fixed on the surroundings, on the trap itself, on the way it was woven and secured. He slowly walked around the pen, Shadow walking beside him, her fur bristling not from fear, but from a deep instinctive dislike of this place, where human evil was disguised as a natural necessity. The raven studied every knot, every support, every element of camouflage. The trap was perfect. It was assembled from materials that could be found within a 5-meter radius, and set up so as not to attract the attention of either Stupin or a stray animal. The calculation of the tension, the camouflage with birch bark, the recess for the trigger stone, everything was flawless, in full accordance with the ancient Taiga art that had been almost lost. The owner didn't just know how to hunt. He knew how to make his creation part of the landscape, a kind of natural phenomenon. "He's a master," whispered Raven, his voice devoid of any intonation, simply stating a fact. Clean work. No traces except those left by Stupin himself, fighting for his life. No scraps of rope, no foreign smells. He approached the main knot that held the entire structure on one of the old, unyielding larch trees. It was a marine knot, a barrel knot used by the Pomors, ideal for such a load. Voron ran his finger along the tightly stretched rope, dried out by the wind, and froze for a moment. Ryabinin, tearing himself away from the radio, became alert, expecting to finally see that very urban clue, a hair, a fingerprint, or a trace of the killer's blood. But Voron was looking at the knot itself. The trap was perfect, but its perfection concealed a mistake, and this mistake was not technical. It was philosophical. Acting out of self-confidence, the owner could not restrain his desire to demonstrate his skill to the only spectator who could appreciate it. The barrel knot that Raven held in his hand was tied with such perfect, excessive force that it was impossible to untie it without cutting the rope. But in the Taiga, where every piece of equipment is valued, where practicality and efficiency are paramount, such a knot is never tied tightly, unless there is a need to reuse it. An experienced Taiga dweller, especially one who acts covertly, would use a sliding knot that is easy to untie, which can be quickly removed, taken away, and reused without leaving any traces. This one was tied like a work of art, demonstrating not practicality, but artistry. "Look." Raven pointed to the knot. He tied it like it was for an exhibition, tightly. He wasn't going to take the rope with him. He wanted me to see how he did it. This is not the mistake of a tracker who saves equipment. This is the mistake of a rich man who can afford to leave a piece of expensive rope as his calling card. And most importantly, this knot, Raven touched the rope, is completely unnecessary. It could have been secured with a simple grip. This is a demonstration. The master didn't just want to kill Stupin. He wanted Raven,
and only Raven, to read it.
He played with him as if he were the only one who could appreciate his artistic execution of the murder. There was more bragging in that knot than in the poacher's entire arsenal.
The master didn't just throw down the gauntlet. He shouted, "I know you're following me, and I'm giving you a chance to see how far behind you are.
I'm the only one who can do this, and I'm the only one worthy of you catching me." Ryabinin was silent, his eyes darting meaninglessly between the perfect knot, Stupin's body, and Voron's cold face.
He realized he had missed something important, something that didn't fit into his protocols. For him, it was just a rope. For Voron, it was a page from the killer's personal diary. Voron felt the game moving to a whole new, dangerous level. The master was not hiding. He was actively leading Voron along, using his own principles and knowledge to tease and entice him.
It was a psychological duel in its purest form. A clash of two minds, one twisted by vanity, the other driven by a cold, stoic need to restore the violated balance.
The Raven looked around the crime scene one last time. He saw that the master had even left a light, barely noticeable trace on the ground. On a clean, flat patch of moss, which should have been washed away by rain or erased by the wind, but which had been deliberately preserved by a small, cleverly
Placed stone.
It was the next mark. Not on a tree, but on the ground. Not a code, but a trace. This meant that the master had stopped talking and had begun to lead him like bait or prey. The game was in full swing, and the master, in his unhealthy superiority, had absolutely no doubt that he was the hunter. The Raven, sensing this self-confidence, felt for the first time in 3 days not anger, but a cold, calculating excitement.
He knew that overconfidence was always the first and most fatal mistake of a predator. And the master had just made it. The Raven nodded to the shadow, and they moved on, away from the pen and the frightened Ryabinin, to the place where a barely discernible, preserved trail led, promising a third, even more sophisticated challenge.
Ryabinin, choking with rage and helplessness, remained in the golden pen, trying to establish communication and organize the evacuation of Stupin's body, while Raven, accompanied by Shadow, continued on his way. He felt the thread of the game that had been forced upon him becoming thinner and tighter, tightening around his own mind. He walked along a barely noticeable trail, preserved by stone, not like a path, but like a page written in impeccable calligraphy. In every footprint, in every displaced piece of moss, in every discarded spruce branch, one could read not so much the direction as the state of the master. The killer was not just moving. He was thinking, and these thoughts, these invisible steps of his mind, Raven had to intercept. He stopped at the edge of a small plateau, which offered a view of the fog-covered peaks and the deep, dark gorge. Raven built a small, smokeless fire in a hearth laid out in advance with stones, a skill that was valued in the Taiga above any firearm, and immersed himself in analysis. The master's logic, as manifested in the murders of Karpov and Stupin, was strikingly clear. Both were sick individuals, violators of the natural balance. One a robber of the earth, the other a destroyer of animals. The master did not kill random people. He struck with precision, carrying out the very sentence that Raven himself had secretly passed on them, but never dared to execute. This similarity was the most disturbing factor. The master was his twisted mirror image. He took a knife
and began to slowly clean the mushroom he had found along the way. His movements mechanical, but his mind working feverishly.
The master not only followed the principle of natural justice, but also demonstrated a profound knowledge of Taiga craftsmanship.
The trap for Stupin, the mark on the cedar tree for Karpov, all this spoke of a man who not only read the Taiga codes, but wrote them on a new authorial level. But it was precisely in this purity of execution that the main vulnerability lay.
The master enjoyed the process, and this enjoyment, this sadistic pleasure, was a distortion of the very essence of their shared philosophy.
Voron remembered the words of his grandfather, an old Taiga man who taught him to read tracts. A predator who kills for hunger is pure. A predator who kills for pleasure is impure. He becomes a sick individual, even if he is a human being.
The master did not kill out of necessity, out of self-defense, or even out of revenge. He killed to assert himself, to prove his exceptionality, and to show off to the only person capable of appreciating his work. It was vanity dressed up in the cloak of justice. That was his weakness. Anyone, even the most cold-blooded predator, makes a mistake when they are cornered, or when they become too confident.
The master was obsessed with himself and his game, and this obsession would sooner or later cause him to violate his impeccable code of survival. The raven realized that in order to catch the master, he had to stop being just a reader of his tracks and become a predictor of his mistakes.
He had to think with his logic, the logic of a man who feels like a part of the Taiga, but at the same time is a stranger, a rich man who came here on safari.
The master, being experienced but not local, could not know all the nuances of the climate, could not feel the subtlest fluctuations in the weather that Raven felt with his skin. He relied on knowledge learned from books or passed on by instructors rather than on instinct, absorbed with his mother's milk and filtered through decades of living in this wilderness. He took a stick and began to draw a diagram of the master's movements on the damp ground. The choice of trails, places to stop, and most importantly, the logic behind the choice of victims. The first victim was a greedy gold miner.
The second was a poacher, a destroyer. Who was next? A man who was disrupting the natural balance, but on a new level. The level of destruction of the Taiga itself.
The only one who could cause such damage while being an influential figure was an official or a large logger who issued permits for predatory logging.
It was a logical chain, and Raven knew that the master, in his desire to continue his judgment, would not deviate from it.
He had to go not to the victim, but to the point where the master would leave the third mark. A point that would not only be a signpost, but also a trap for Voron himself.
The master would not stop until he showed Voron that he was the only one who could bring about absolute justice. It was a duel that would end in either capture or death, and Raven had no doubt that deep down the master wanted the latter, to forever cement his status as the sole supreme predator. The shadow raised his head, his black, shining eyes fixed on the top of an old cedar tree towering above the plateau.
The raven sensed something that Ryabinin would not have noticed. A faint, unnatural sound of wind that was not the movement of air, but a vibration. He raised his head. At the very top of the cedar, 50 meters above the ground, where neither detectives nor random passers-by could see it, something white and thin fluttered in the wind. Raven took the binoculars he always carried with him and adjusted the focus. What he saw made him freeze.
It was a bird feather, stuck in a cedar cone attached to a thin, dry branch. The feather was not ordinary, but white. A rare feather of a bird of prey that did not live in these parts. Perhaps some kind of mountain eagle or falcon, which usually nested much higher, beyond the mountain pass. The feather was not stuck vertically, but at an angle of 45 degrees. And this angle was not accidental. In the old Taiga code, this angle indicated a mountain pass, overcoming obstacles, and the way up. This was the third mark, and it was the most sophisticated of all. It said, "I am going to the mountain pass. My next victim is the one who controls the heights, the one who sits higher than the rest." The name of the official who covered up illegal logging in the mountain forests, Nikolai Zharkov, came back to Voron with absolute clarity. The man who issued permits like printed candy wrappers was the perfect, sick individual for the master. But most importantly, the feather of a mountain bird, not native to this plateau, was a deliberate complication, an indication of the geographical region, not just the victim. The raven felt a rush of cold excitement. The master had not simply pointed to the victim. He had pointed to the conditions of the hunt. A mountain pass where the weather changes in an instant, where there are no traces except stone and snow, where survival depends on the minute. He had thrown down the gauntlet to the raven, not only a challenge, but a test of his skill. If Raven failed, the official would be dead, and the game would continue. If Raven succeeded, he would have a chance to outmaneuver the master, to anticipate his next mistake, which would inevitably follow his overconfidence. Raven quickly gathered his things. He knew he had to go straight across the gorge and climb the pass before the master struck his third blow. He couldn't count on Ryabinin's help. By the time he reached the city and returned with the helicopter, it would be too late. This was his hunt, his duty, and his game. He hoisted his backpack, nodded to Shadow, and they merged with the twilight, moving toward the mountains, toward the third and most dangerous clue. The climb to the pass indicated by the white feather was not only a physical challenge, but also a test of endurance. Raven and Shadow moved through the highlands, where the taiga suddenly gave way to rocky tundra and sharp, icy cliffs. The master had not been mistaken in choosing this place for his third victim. The official Zharkov, who according to the killer's logic, was the highest-ranking disturber of the balance. The mountain pass had always been a territory of absolute, ruthless truth, where survival depended not on wealth or power, but on strength of spirit and knowledge of the weather. The chase was becoming increasingly difficult. The master, acting in his usual manner, left no obvious traces. He walked on rocks, on dry, hard areas where his bootprints disappeared as soon as they appeared, and used the natural corridors between the rocks, which themselves served as perfect camouflage. At first, Raven sensed his presence through indirect signs. A barely noticeable shift in the moss at the edge of the cliff. 3 small, identical pebbles arranged in a way that was uncharacteristic of a natural pile. Or the snow melting under a rock at a slightly faster rate than it should have. These were not human traces, but shadows. And only Raven's long-standing, ingrained instinct allowed him to read this invisible manuscript. But then the weather changed dramatically, as if the taiga itself had decided to take part in the game, throwing a thick, wet veil over them. A blizzard began. In the mountains,
This meant an instant drop in visibility and temperature, and the complete disappearance of all landmarks and traces. The wind howled in the gorges like a hungry beast, turning every step into a struggle. The shadow pressed itself against Raven's feet, its instinct telling it of the danger posed by this element. In such conditions, even the most experienced tracker becomes blind, and a predator becomes defenseless. Raven realized that this was exactly what the master had been waiting for.
He wasn't just leading him along the trail. He was leading him to a point where the external conditions would level their chances, but at the same time, give an advantage to the one who was better prepared.
At the same time, the master, confident in his skill, expected the Raven to lose him, get stuck, give up, or, even better, become a victim of the pass himself. But that was his mistake. Unlike him, the Raven wasn't playing.
He lived in this element. He felt it.
They walked on for another 3 hours, guided by the vibration that Raven picked up in the rock beneath his feet, and the faint, intermittent whistle of the wind, which in the high mountains always indicates a pass.
Suddenly, Shadow let out a short, muffled growl and stopped, pressing his nose into a crevice between two huge, moss-covered boulders. Raven realized they had arrived. He squeezed through a narrow passage and found himself on a small wind-protected platform, a natural niche in the rock. Here, under a thick cedar branch that had miraculously survived all the mountain winds, was an abandoned camp.
The camp had not been set up hastily, but with a view to a long, comfortable stay.
There was a neatly stacked woodpile of dry wood, the remains of a small fire that had been extinguished according to all the rules, and a hastily assembled but warm sleeping area. The owner was here.
He was in no hurry, not chasing his prey, Zarkov, who was obviously supposed to show up here later on his illegal business. The owner was waiting. He was resting, knowing that Raven, his only worthy opponent, was hot on his heels.
He enjoyed his power over time and space. Voron began to methodically examine the camp, not touching anything that could be of obvious value to the police. He didn't need DNA. He needed the master's thoughts. He was looking for signs of self-confidence, traces of pride. He found them. First, there was the fire. It had been extinguished perfectly, but nearby, pressed down by a flat stone, lay a piece of birch bark that the master had used to light it. The bark had been twisted into a perfect cone. It was the gesture of an aesthete, a man who makes things beautiful, even where no one will see them. Raven, if he were in the master's place, would have simply crumpled it up and burned it, leaving no trace. But the master left his perfect trash behind. Secondly, on the roost, under a hastily spread sleeping bag, Raven discovered something more valuable. A trace that the master had obviously intended to take away, but in his haste, or more likely, in his confident calculation that Raven would not find his camp, had forgotten. It was a piece of oiled, thick paper, pressed down with charcoal. Raven carefully unfolded it. It turned out to be a map, but not a map of the area, something more like a sketch. It was drawn with thin, confident lines, and represented not a diagram of a mountain pass, but a labyrinth. In the center of the labyrinth was a complex, multi-part symbol. The same bird, the same V crossed out with a wavy line. The master's signature. One of the lines of the labyrinth, sharply emerging from the center, led to the edge, where a small, stylized figure of a raven was drawn. Below it was a short but eloquent code, consisting of 3 notches and 1 dot. The raven instantly deciphered it. The code meant, "You are the prey. You are the target." At that moment, the master changed the rules of the game. He didn't just point to his next victim. He declared the raven to be his next prey.
Karpov was just a diversion, the perfect cover for the main blow. The master, reveling in his superiority, decided that he could only achieve absolute victory by eliminating the only one who could read him.
He didn't want to just catch Raven. He wanted to outrun him, bring him to his knees, using his own code. The Raven felt a chill run down his spine, not from the mountain wind, but from this sudden, acute threat.
He looked at the card, at this brazen, confident challenge. The master was not just a predator. He was a gambler who couldn't stop until he had bet everything.
His mistake was not that he had left the map behind, but that he had believed in his own infallibility, that Raven would play by his rules. The blizzard intensified, turning the gorge into a solid, white chaos. Raven knew his time was up. He had to act. Hiding the card, leaving the camp without leaving the slightest trace of his presence. That was his main task. Now he had to run away from the master, not look for him, so that he could turn the tide of the game without being in the crosshairs. He burned the birch bark, carefully smoothed out the fire pit, hid the encrypted map in an airtight pocket, and moved away. He was leaving not out of fear, but out of the need to change roles. The hunter had just become the prey, and that meant the game had become deadly serious. Leaving the abandoned camp in the heart of the mountain pass, Voron knew that he was no longer just a detective, but a fugitive. The challenge card, hidden in his pocket, not only declared him the next target, but also made him a suspect in the eyes of those who remained below. Ryabinin, stuck with the dead Stupin and waiting for reinforcements, would inevitably begin to piece together a logical chain of events. Raven, with his strange philosophy of natural justice, had disappeared into the mountains just after the two saboteurs of the Taiga had been eliminated. The young lieutenant feared and despised Voron, but his instructions demanded logic, and logic pointed to the simplest explanation: complicity, or even direct execution. The Raven understood this and acted accordingly. He had to leave quickly and without a trace, leaving no clues that could confirm the police's suspicions. Otherwise, his hunt would end before it even began. He descended from the pass at double speed, using invisible trails known only to him, avoiding any places where he could be spotted from a helicopter or from a distance. The blizzard, which at first seemed like an enemy, now became an ally, erasing his tracks and masking his movements. The shadow moved alongside him, its hunter's instinct suddenly switching to prey instinct, heightened. It sensed danger not ahead, but behind, the danger of invisible pursuit. Raven knew that the master would not rush into pursuit immediately. The master was a player and enjoyed the pause, the realization that his worthy opponent was finally playing by his rules. This pause was a gift that Raven had to use to identify his pursuer. The maze on the master's map was not only a metaphor, but also a precise indication of location. The line leading to the Raven figure actually pointed to a geographical point, an old abandoned hunting hideout that once belonged to a local gamekeeper who disappeared 20 years ago. This hideout was known only to a select few and was located deep in a cedar forest on the western slope. The master, who had known the Taiga since childhood, had obviously stumbled upon it before. By inviting Voron to this hideout, he wasn't just giving him a clue. He was inviting him into his personal, intimate space, where he could store more than just equipment. It was the last desperate gesture of a self-confident rich man who wanted to be recognized and appreciated. The journey took almost a day, and when Raven finally arrived at the location, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in ominous, blood-red tones. The hiding place was a cleverly camouflaged wooden box, half buried in the ground, and covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves and moss. Raven opened it without difficulty. The master hadn't even bothered to put a complex lock on it, as if he knew that the key to it lay in his rival's head. There was no gold or weapons inside, which confirmed Raven's guess. The master didn't need standard Taiga supplies. His goal was different. At the very top lay some carelessly discarded, but obviously expensive, practically new equipment. Gloves made of thin but durable leather. A compass in a heavy brass case. Everything testified to high class and considerable wealth. But Crow was not interested in them. Deeper down, under a layer of camping gear, he found two items that instantly illuminated the dark shaft of his guesses. The first item was a lighter. It was unusual, massive, silver, and engraved. On the side was engraved a complex heraldic coat of arms. Not a family crest, but, judging by all appearances, the emblem of some very large corporation, probably a logging or mining company, using symbols of wild animals and mountains. And under this coat of arms were the initials R-A-L. Initials that belonged, as Voron suddenly realized with chilling clarity, to Ruslan Anatolievich Larin, the owner of the largest logging holding in the region. A man whose name constantly appeared in the news about illegal logging, corruption, and the privatization of entire forest areas. He was a man who, being rich and influential, came to the Taiga to, as he himself put it, take a break from civilization. That is, essentially, on safari. Voron knew of his existence, but never associated him with anything other than greed. The second item confirmed this assumption, adding to it an element of distorted personal history. It was an old, yellowed photograph. It showed a boy of about 10 years old, in expensive but dirty clothes. He was crouching by a fire, and next to him stood a tall, sullen old man, a local gamekeeper who probably owned this cache. The old man looked annoyed, but the boy, clearly the future Larin, looked at him with adoration and pride. Behind the boy, barely noticeable, was that same, now familiar mark, an inverted V with a wavy line. Voron understood. Larin had been here as a child, probably brought here to toughen up, and he had learned the codes and laws of the Taiga from that very gamekeeper, who may have taught him the philosophy of balance. But, returning here rich and powerful, he distorted that philosophy, turning it into a license for sadistic games. Larin, rich, influential, knowledgeable about the Taiga since childhood, confident in his impunity, and considering himself the sole supreme arbiter. A man who buys entire forests and then plays hunter, killing those who, in his opinion, harm his toy. There was no need for his actions, only arrogant superiority and a desire to be recognized. And the only one who could recognize him was Voron. Raven felt his anger, restrained throughout the chase, turn into cold, steely determination. Larin was not just a criminal. He was a desecrator of the code. He used the great philosophy of the Taiga to live by the rules, to maintain balance, to justify his base, sadistic desire to kill. He, the master, was a sick individual in two ways. He violated both natural and human law. The Raven left the hideout, taking with him only a lighter and a map, which served as evidence, and, more importantly, as the key to his next move. Now he had a name, a face, and, most importantly, a motive. He knew that Laren would not stop and that he, Raven, was still his prey. But now, knowing his enemy, he could turn this role into a tactical advantage. He had to catch Laren in a mistake that, in his arrogance, he would inevitably make. He climbed out of the cedar grove, and Shadow, sensing her master's change of mood, from analysis to action, pressed herself against his leg. The night was cold, full of watchful silence.
Voron looked in the direction where the main road led, the road to the city, to power and law. He understood that the police were probably already looking for him, based on false conclusions. But he couldn't go to the city.
Laren was too influential, and any evidence, except for the arrest itself, could be destroyed. This game had to end where it began, in the Taiga, according to its own harsh laws.
The Raven set up a temporary camp deep in the forest, in a place that even Laren, with his tiger instincts, would be unlikely to find without spending a lot of time searching. There was absolute, untouched silence around them, broken only by the occasional crackling of resin in the fire and the concentrated breathing of Shadow, who, curled up in a ball, guarded his sleep and his thoughts. Raven did not sleep.
On a piece of old oiled tarpaulin lay the trophies he had taken from the hiding place. A massive silver lighter with a coat of arms, a yellowed photograph, and, most importantly, an encrypted map, declaring him the next target.
Ivan Andreevich was in no hurry to burn or throw away this evidence. He studied it like the pages of a novel that had suddenly turned out to be written about him.
Ruslan Anatolievich Laren, owner of logging empires, a man whose name was synonymous with predatory logging and greed, turned out to be the very master who passed natural judgment on other sick individuals. This paradox was the crux of the conflict.
Laren, who himself destroyed the balance for profit, appropriated the right to restore it by killing those who violated the balance at a lower level.
Voron clutched the lighter in his hand, feeling the cold metal that symbolized enormous wealth and arrogant indifference. It was not a tool for survival, but a luxury item, brought to the wilderness as a symbol of superiority. The realization of the master's personality put everything in its place. His actions were no longer acts of pure revenge or fanaticism. They became part of a carefully staged spectacle, an expensive toy that Laren bought for himself to escape the boredom of civilization.
He hunted to feel like a god, and he chose the Raven as his only spectator, and, ultimately, his most coveted prey.
His goal was not to restore balance, but to prove his absolute superiority over the only person whose skill in the Taiga he could respect.
The Raven was a trophy for him, one that would confirm his status not just as a rich man, but as the supreme predator. Laren confidently wanted the Raven to find him. He wanted to be identified so that the whole world would know who had brought the legendary Raven to its knees.
"He's playing,"
Raven whispered, addressing the silence rather than the shadow, like a rich man who buys himself a nature reserve and decides who gets to live there and who gets to die.
He thinks he's above the rules because he paid for the game. This understanding revealed Laren's main weakness: his wealth and influence in the city, his habit of absolute power.
made him believe that the same power extended to the unwritten laws of the Taiga.
He relied on his training, his expensive equipment, and the codes he had learned. But he forgot about humility, which is the only guarantee of survival in this wild, unyielding realm.
Voron returned to analyzing his set of clues, focusing on the marks left by the master. He recalled all 3 messages: the complex symbol on the cedar tree near the body of the gold miner Karpov, the petroglyph on the stone pointing to Stupin, and finally, the mountain eagle feather stuck in a cedar cone on the pass.
All of them were flawless from the point of view of Taiga coding. All testified to incredible skill. But Raven, already knowing that the master was Larin, began to look not for the tracker's mistakes, but for the rich man's mistakes.
And he found it, examining the details of the last mark in his mind. He remembered that the cedar cone with the white feather stuck in it was not simply attached, but glued to the branch with a thin, almost invisible growth. The Raven did not attach any importance to this at the time, attributing it to local moss or lichen. But now, knowing about Larin's city life and foreign origins, he returned to this detail. The growth was not moss. It was a wood-decaying fungus with a very dense, almost plasticine-like structure, which the master had used to securely attach the feather to the thin branch, choosing it for its strength and quick drying properties. The Raven knew that this fungus, with its characteristic whitish hue and unusual porosity, did not grow in this part of the taiga, especially on cedar trees. It was typical of more southern, humid regions, or of coniferous forests located much closer to the foothills, where Larin might have flown in on his private helicopter. It was not a mistake in the trap's design, or in the camouflage of the trail. It was a geographical mistake. The growth, which was supposed to serve as an invisible fastener, became the loudest cry that the master was a stranger who had brought this material with him, believing that in this wilderness, no one would be able to tell one mushroom from another. It was a manifestation of pure self-confidence. Larin was so... He used what he had at hand, what he had brought with him, as if to say, I can impose my... and Voron will play along anyway, because he needs the game. Larin, in his arrogance, failed to become part of the Taiga. He merely bought himself a membership to its elite club, while remaining a tourist himself. He expected that Voron, armed with this information, would try to use it to call the police or engage in open combat. But Raven now saw that his task was not simply to catch Larin, but to catch him using his own self-confidence and his own alien logic. Larin relied on an impeccable code, and that code turned out to have a flaw, an imported fungus. Voron had to become not prey, but bait, and not a hunter, but a trap designer. He had to create conditions where Larin, acting on the logic of a predator, would not notice the error in his own calculation. An error that only a person who did not fully understand how the great, complex organism of the taiga worked could make. The master's game was over. Now the Raven's game was beginning. He threw away his lighter and began to quickly pack his backpack, deciding to go northeast to the old high ridge, which offered a perfect view of the nearest mountain passes, a place that Larin, according to his own logic, would consider ideal for the final battle. He was preparing for a change of roles, for a turning point in which the prey would have to change its mask and become a real, local predator. After Raven realized Larin's key mistake,
the use of a non-native mushroom. His anger finally transformed into cold, crystal-clear calculation. He was no longer a hunted beast. He had become the architect of the trap. His new task was not simply to catch up with the master, but to force him to come to a place that Raven himself would choose. A place where the logic of a self-confident city dweller, even one skilled at reading tracks, would fail under the pressure of the true laws of the wild. The Raven moved northeast, toward an old, high ridge known as Bald Hill. It was the highest point within a radius of 20 kilometers, offering a perfect view of all the mountain passes and valleys. Laren, as a man obsessed with control and superiority, would undoubtedly seek to occupy this position. From Lysaya Sopka, he would be able to observe everything that was happening below and wait for the Raven, like a king waiting for his vassal. It was an ideal and therefore predictable move on his part. The Raven's strategy was based on his knowledge of the terrain and the master's psychology. Laren knew the Taiga code, but he had studied it, while the Raven lived it. That was the difference between a learned language and a native tongue. The Raven began to leave marks along his path. But these were not just false tracks. They were carefully thought out, fake messages, encrypted in a code that the master could not fail to read, but which led him to a false conclusion. The first false mark was left on an old boulder by the stream, split by frost. Raven carved a symbol in the moss that meant retreat or change of course in their secret language. But next to it, using a twig, he deliberately moved several small stones, imitating the footprint of a boot rushing southward toward more populated areas. Laren, reading retreat and seeing the false trail, had to come to the only conclusion. The prey was frightened, ran to civilization for help, and now it could be caught where it felt safe. This maneuver was supposed to give Voron extra time and divert Laren's attention in the wrong direction, playing on his confidence that Voron, like any person, would seek refuge among his own kind at a critical moment. The second mark was more subtle and concerned exclusively Laren's complacency. It was left on a spruce branch that hung over a barely noticeable path leading, it seemed, straight to Bald Hill. The Raven broke the branch in a special way. 2 short breaks and 1 long one, which meant the straight path. But under the branch itself, he deliberately left several crumpled old fir cones, which in the local Taiga code meant deliberate simplicity or too clear truth. It was an invitation. The Raven, as if talking to the master, said, "I know you want me to come straight to you. I'm coming." But the goal was different. The real path that the Raven chose for himself was through the swampy lowlands, which Laren, relying on his expensive equipment, probably considered too dirty and slow. The Raven knew that mud was the only real way to hide his tracks. He moved through the lowlands slowly, heavily, but safely. Every step was carefully thought out. He used his skills to perfection. He placed old, fallen tree trunks under his feet so as not to leave clear footprints in the soft soil, and moved exclusively during weather changes, when a sudden gust of wind or a brief rain shower helped him hide. His scent and sounds. The Raven knew that his main trap should not be man-made, but natural, only reinforced by human will. He chose not Lysaya Sopka itself, but an abandoned hunting lodge located slightly lower down the slope, which offered a view of the entire ridge. According to his calculations, Laren should arrive there within the next day, following his false trail. The hut was old and dilapidated, the perfect place for an ambush, or more precisely, for the final meeting. Upon arriving at the location, Raven did not enter. He began to prepare. He focused not on defense, but on manipulating the environment.
He carefully cut the thin roots of an old rotten pine tree at the edge of the cliff, making its position critically unstable.
He knew that the pine tree would not fall on its own, but, under certain circumstances, a strong gust of wind, a push, or, most importantly, vibration from a heavy, confident step.
He calculated the angle of fall and exactly where the trunk would fall, right onto the narrow, only passage to the abandoned hut. It was not murder. It was immobilization. Voron did not want to kill Larin. He wanted to immobilize him, deprive him of the opportunity to run away and, most importantly, deprive him of the opportunity to play master. The trap was designed not for death, but for humiliation. To prove that Larin, for all his wealth, was
Just a guest in someone else's house.
having completed his preparations. Raven climbed onto one of the giant rocks, from where he could see the entire path leading to the hut. He and Shadow now became part of the landscape, blending in with the moss and shadows. He waited. He knew that Larin, having read his false markings, would sense the taste of imminent victory and arrive at this place with redoubled confidence, expecting his prey to come to him. The change of roles took place quietly, without loud words or shots. The raven, the fugitive, and the target became a patient spider in the center of his web, and the rich, all-powerful master turned into a fly, flying toward an artificial but alluring light. The game was not over, but its outcome now depended not on Larin's rules, but on Raven's deep, undistorted knowledge of how the Taiga breathes and lives. He simply waited for greed and self-confidence to lead his opponent to the cut route. The sun, hidden behind the ridge, had long since ceased to give light, and twilight reigned in the abandoned hunting lodge, broken only by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp that Voron had placed on a rickety table. The shadow lay pressed against his feet like an old obsidian statue, but its ears were pricked alertly, and the muscles beneath its fur were tense. Raven sat completely dissolved in the shadows, his figure indistinct and motionless, and waited. He waited for the sound that would precede the master's arrival, but Larin, as Raven had predicted, was not stupid. He was merely overconfident. He did not take the direct, open path that Raven had staged as the route to the refuge, but he did not waste extra hours going around it either. He moved along the slope, along the edge where the ground was hardest, and where his expensive, technically perfect boots would leave a minimal but clear trail. Without realizing it, Raven caught this movement, this barely audible sliding of expensive membrane fabric against thorny bushes. A sound that a real taiga dweller wearing a quilted jacket would never make. Larin, who was supposed to be his prey, entered the perimeter of the trap with grace and confidence, expecting to see a beast cowering in a corner, not a hunter sitting by the fire. Larin appeared in the doorway like a ghost emerging from the darkness. He was tall and well-built, and his movements betrayed a familiar urban authority that could not completely disappear, even in this wild wilderness. He was wearing expensive, functional clothing, which, unlike Voron's worn and smoke-soaked gear, looked too new, too clean for this place. In his hand he held a powerful camping lantern, the beam of which, however, he directed not at Voron, but at the floor, demonstrating not aggression, but superiority. "I knew you would come, Ivan Andreevich." His voice was quiet, even, without a hint of breathlessness or tension.
I didn't even have to look very hard. You left me a whole poem of clues.
But I must admit, your attempt to flee to the settlements was charmingly naive. You couldn't do that. You can't live without this forest. Voron, without changing his posture or looking away, nodded silently, acknowledging defeat in this micro-game.
He knew that Laren had read his false mark, but had not read the true meaning.
The master entered the hut, glanced around it with a dismissive look, and stood opposite the raven, separated from him only by a rickety table with a lamp. The shadow let out a low growl, but the raven calmed it with a slight, almost invisible movement of his fingers, without breaking eye contact with Laren. "The poem," replied Raven, his voice dry and low, like the rustle of gravel. "You wanted me to see myself in it. You wanted me to come. Well, here I am. How confident were you in your code to come here alone?" Laren smiled, and it was a broad, predatory smile, completely devoid of warmth. "Absolutely sure, because I understand you, Raven. We are the same, like reflections in still water. You are me, if I had not been born rich, and I am you, if you are not so weak. We both see that this world, this Taiga, is sick. It is being devoured by greed, filth, corruption, gold rotting in other people's pockets. You know that these people I got rid of, Karpov, Stupin, the official, they were all sick individuals, viruses. They deserved only one thing: a quick and honest death in the forest." He paused, his eyes flashing in the dim light, and placed a heavy hunting knife with a bone handle on the edge of the table, demonstrating not a threat, but the equality of predators who had come to a common meal. "You acted according to my code," Laren continued, his tone becoming almost confessional. "According to the code of natural justice. But you, Raven, are weak. You cannot bring yourself to cleanse the world completely. You limit yourself with human laws that you yourself despise. But I went further. I became not just an observer, but an active mechanism of balance. And now that I have found the only one who understands me, I invite you to join me. Together, we can turn this rotten empire into a true sanctuary, where there will be no place for greed or lies. You are the eyes of the Taiga. I am its hand. It will be a great undertaking." Voron did not move. He looked not at Laren's knife, not at his expensive jacket, but at his eyes, and saw in them not philosophy, but pure, undiluted obsession. The pleasure of the process of killing, which Laren tried to disguise as noble purification. "You are not a code, Laren," the raven said slowly and meaningfully. "And you are not a mechanism. You are a sick beast who covers up his sadism with the idea of justice. Justice in the taiga is when the prey runs and the predator is hungry. It is when you kill for food, not for pleasure, and you do not enjoy the process. You are a killer who loves to watch his victims suffer. You killed Karpov because he was greedy, but you enjoyed watching him die, and watching me, Voron, try to solve your riddle. You crossed the line, Laren. You didn't restore balance.
You disrupted it because you killed not out of necessity, but for the sake of feeling superior. For the first time, something other than complacency flashed in Laren's eyes. A brief, sharp flash of anger. Rage that Raven knew firsthand. The rage of a trapped predator. You've always been a moralist, Raven. You hide from the world in your rotting hut, in your outdated codes. You could have been the king of this taiga, but you remained only its guardian. He leaned forward sharply, resting his palms on the table. Your code is weakness. My code is strength. And I will prove it to you, right here, right now. You brought me to you, Raven. You made your choice. Now it's my turn. Laren grabbed his knife from the table, his movement quick and practiced, but Raven was already waiting for this moment. He knew that Laren would not shoot. He enjoyed face-to-face combat too much. It was a duel imposed by Laren, but the script was now being written by Raven. With Laren's first movements, Shadow, like a taut bowstring, jumped up from her seat, and a dull ringing sound echoed through the quiet winter hut. Not a shot, but a harbinger of a fight that would end with the fall of one of them. The clang of clashing metal in the confined space of the winter hut was sharp and short, like the death cry of a captured bird. Raven reacted instantly, knocking over the rickety table that served as the only obstacle between him and Laren, and at the same moment, pulling out his old, trusty knife with a birch bark handle. Laren, whose movement was quick but straightforward, met resistance where he expected only flight. Voron's knife, dull and inconspicuous, clashed with the master's shiny, large blade, and the spark carved out of this collision was the only light besides the flickering, almost extinguished lamp. The fight began, not as a shootout, but as a clash between two predators, brought together by rage and hatred for a single, primitive common denominator: survival. Laren moved heavily but powerfully, using all the strength of his body, trained in city gyms, but applied in the conditions of wild combat. His movements were calculated to suppress, crush, and prove the superiority of physical strength and expensive, razor-sharp weapons. He pressed forward, each of his lunges aimed at the torso, at the large arteries. And in him one could sense not just the thirst for murder, but the enjoyment of power over another's life. But Voron was different. He used not strength, but elasticity, not direct confrontation, but evasion and rebound. He was like a flexible cedar trunk that bends in a hurricane, but does not break. His style was the art of survival, taken to the absolute. He did not waste energy on parrying. He used Laren's movements against him, deflecting blows into empty space, directing his opponent towards the walls of the winter hut, towards sharp corners. The fight was too close for knives. Laren, in his furious blindness, tried to hit Voron on the head with the hilt, but Voron ducked, dodging the blow, and, using Laren's momentum, threw him forcefully against the back wall of the hut. A dull thud, the crack of old wood, and Laren staggered for a moment. That was enough. Voron did not finish him off in the confined space, where the stronger man had the advantage. He knew that his trap was waiting outside. Voron leaped to the doorway, slipped past Tenny, who was screaming and rushing into battle, and jumped outside into the cold, damp air. Laren jumped out after him, breathing heavily, but his anger gave him strength. He was convinced that his prey was running away again, escaping into the darkness. The raven, however, did not run far. He led his master along a narrow, barely visible path that wound along the very edge of Bald Hill.
to the place where he had left his main gift. The raven moved silently, his feet knowing every stone, every root, every patch of loose, slippery ground. He used the terrain as part of his body. Laren, despite all his Taiga skills, moved with excessive self-confidence, with the confidence of a man who knows that his equipment can withstand any dirt and his training any obstacle.
He chased Voron, ignoring the signs. He was not looking for Voron's trail, but for a silhouette that he could catch up with and destroy.
Voron deliberately stumbled and fell right in front of a steep, clayey slope, where he knew Laren would inevitably try to gain an advantage in height.
When Laren saw him fall and lunge forward to deliver the decisive blow, Voron, like a snake, slid to the side, throwing a handful of wet, sticky mud that he had managed to scoop up in the lowland at his opponent's feet.
Laren slipped, lost his balance, and trying to keep himself upright, instinctively grabbed the nearest large object that could serve as a support. That object was the very old, rotten pine tree at the edge of the cliff that Voron had cut down.
It was his fatal mistake.
Laren forgot that the Taiga does not forgive haste and anger. He forgot that overconfidence is the quickest way to fall. At that moment, he was not a predator. He was just a rich, angry man.
The pine tree, whose roots had been cut the day before, could not withstand the sudden, sharp load, and Laren, falling down, forced the trunk to collapse with all his weight.
There was a dull crack of roots, the rustle of crumbling earth, and then a low, drawn-out groan of a falling tree. The trunk did not fall into the abyss, but directly onto the path, cutting Laren off from the hut and from freedom. Moreover, as it fell, the tree shifted a large layer of loose soil and several large old stones, which rolled down into a narrow gorge. Laren, not having had time to pull his foot out from under the root, found himself trapped, immobilized, pinned down. He was pinned between the trunk and the slippery, wet boulder, his expensive equipment and trained muscles unable to help him against the simple laws of physics, reinforced by a subtle calculation. He screamed. It was not a cry of pain, but a cry of pure, frenzied rage and awareness of his own humiliation. The raven, standing slightly higher on solid ground, watched without emotion. The fight ended, not because of his brute strength, but because of his skill. Because he was able to use the natural conditions that Laren considered his personal training ground against him. The master who was so proud of his code had been caught out by a mistake that only the most self-confident, anger-blinded predator would make. The quiet, ringing sound of the knife that Voron slowly sheathed was the final chord of this battle. Laren, lying under the tree trunk, was alive. But his hunt was over. And now it was time for the most important thing. The moment of truth. The cry of rage that burst from Laren's chest was the last echo of his confident hunt, now forever buried under the weight of the old, fallen cedar tree. Laren lay immobilized, pinned down by the trunk, which had pinned his leg below the knee, not breaking the bone, but making any movement impossible. The sharp pain from the pressure and the realization of his complete, humiliating defeat mingled in his eyes with the dirt and sweat. He was on his own territory, armed, prepared, rich. And he had lost to a man who had used his own philosophy against him. The raven slowly descended toward him, his movements cautious and calculated,
as if he did not want to disturb the fragile balance that had just been established. He stopped 2 steps away, looking down at the master. The shadow, which until that moment had been held back only by the quiet, steely will of its master, now came closer and sat down next to the raven. Its black fur blending in with the shadows, its eyes, yellow and cold, fixed on Larin's face.
Her quiet, guttural growl, like the roar of a mountain stream, was the only sound breaking the silence after the collapse.
"You called yourself the master," said Raven, and there was neither triumph nor anger in his voice, only a calm, dry statement of fact. "But you became prey. You fell into a trap that was not set by man, but prepared by nature for those who forget its power." He knelt down, not approaching, but only watching Larin's reaction. The master was breathing heavily, trying to free his leg, but the trunk was too secure, and any movement only increased the pain. Larin looked up, and in his eyes, Raven saw what he was looking for. Not fear of death, but animal rage, a desperate attempt to preserve what remained of his pride. "Finish it, Raven," Larin croaked, his voice broken. "If you truly believe in your code of balance, kill me. Cleanse the system. You're right. I'm sick. I've upset the balance. Death should be quick and fair. Restore order." He waited for the blow, waited for Raven, as the highest predator, to carry out the sentence that Larin had already passed on himself. It was Larin's last card, to impose his philosophy on Raven even in the moment of defeat, to force him to become an executioner and thus lower himself to his level. For Raven, this was the true moment of truth, the key test. Until that moment, all his hunting had been merely a response to a challenge, to crack the code, find the mistake, neutralize the threat. But now, when the beast was caught and immobilized, when his own life was completely safe and the life of his enemy was in his hands, the question of his own code arose. Could he kill? Could he do what Larin so demonstratively did, hiding behind the idea of justice? No. His path was different. His justice never included the enjoyment of death. For him, murder was always a tragedy, always a violation, even if it was murder for survival. "You are waiting for a quick death, Larin," said Voron, and each of his words sounded like a stone falling into a deep well. Death in the Taiga. It would be fair if you killed out of necessity. But you killed for pleasure. You dragged out the process. You played games. You wanted to prove that you were above nature, that you were its judge. You deserve not its judgment, but the judgment of man. A long, humiliating, urban trial where no one will be interested in your false philosophy, and your money will not be able to buy either justice or balance. Larin shuddered, and for the first time, genuine fear flashed in his eyes. Not fear of physical death, but fear of losing everything: power, reputation, superiority. This was what he feared more than the knife. He was afraid of returning to the world he despised and ruled, but now as a prisoner, as a sick individual, on public display. This fear was far more destructive than a quick death at the hands of Voron. You have no right," Larin muttered, trying to raise his hand, but the shadow, sensing the movement, growled,
and Laren pulled his hand back, realizing that the animal would not allow him to make his final desperate gesture.
You are as weak as the rest. You hide behind the law. The raven stood up. He did not argue. The truth was elsewhere, and he knew it. You did not violate my code, Laren. The raven repeated, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the trees where the mountains began. You violated hers. And for that, I will not execute you. I will restore order. And order requires that you answer in the world you so wanted to change, but which you actually only used for your games. He turned away, took a few steps back, and despite his physical exhaustion after the fight and chase, there was an unyielding,
Quiet strength in his back.
Raven glanced back at Shadow, who was still sitting next to Laren, her presence the most reliable shield. Shadow, guard him, Raven ordered. Don't let a single mouse touch him until the guests arrive. Laika wagged her tail briefly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the order.
Raven pulled a satellite phone out of his backpack, a device he used only in extreme, life-threatening situations. He knew that the call would mean the invasion of the city into his secluded world, the hustle and bustle, the interrogations, and the filth of formalities. But that was the price of balance. It was a price he was willing to pay to prove to Laren, and more importantly, to himself, that his code was not a weakness, but the highest form of strength. The moment when Laren realized that he would not be killed turned out to be more frightening for him than the prospect of death itself. Voron did not waste words on threats. He simply took a sturdy, wide belt from his shoulder, which he usually used to carry his prey, and, without rushing, methodically, began to tie him up. The cedar trunk securely held Laren's leg in place, but his arms and torso still posed a potential danger.
Voron worked with surgical precision,
Using dead knots that he had learned over many years in the Taiga, knots that could not be loosened without a knife and additional effort.
Laren resisted at first, his body twitching in helpless rage. But each jerk only reminded him of his humiliation and the sharp pain in his crushed leg.
Then he fell silent, watching Raven's movements with the numb attention with which a victim watches the actions of a predator.
You don't kill, Laren exhaled, as the belt tightened around his wrists behind his back.
His voice was a mixture of contempt and despair. That means you're a coward. You're afraid to get your hands dirty. Voron, checking the strength of the knot, only shook his head slightly, without looking up.
He already knew this move, this last attempt at psychological pressure. Laren was trying to reduce their struggle to a primitive choice: murder or weakness. But Raven chose a third path, which was both the most difficult and the most just.
The Taiga knows only necessity, Laren,
Voron finally said, finishing his work and taking a step back to examine the result. A predator kills to live or to protect its territory. But you killed to prove your superiority, for the pleasure you called purification. That is not necessity. It is a disease, and nature does not treat diseases that it did not create.
Voron approached the fallen trunk and pushed it gently to test its stability. The trunk was like stone, a reliable living prison into which the master had walked himself.
Laren coughed, trying to gather his strength. But you could have restored your balance. Death would have been a relief. The raven turned to him, and there was no pity in his colorless eyes.
It was the gaze of a judge who passes sentence without feeling personal animosity. Death in the taiga, according to our old code, must be quick, fair, and it must become food for those who remain. But you violated not my code, but hers. You do not deserve a quick death, Larin. You deserve a long trial by the city. Voron spoke of what Larin, powerful and arrogant, feared most: loss of control, public humiliation, the fact that his carefully constructed philosophy would be dissected in the light of day, in stuffy offices, and turned into a set of pieces of evidence. Larin wanted to become a legend, the harsh executioner of the Taiga. Voron reduced him to an ordinary, albeit unusually cruel, criminal, handed over to the jurisdiction of the very system he so despised and exploited. In the city, Larin. Voron lifted his backpack, checking the fasteners. There is no balance, no justice as you understand it. There are only rules, protocols, endless, dirty, long red tape. Your money will speak. Your lawyers will shout. But you will rot in this human vanity, proving to everyone that you are not a sick individual, but a genius. And that will be your real sentence. Voron fell silent. There was no moralizing in his words, only a statement of a cruel but honest truth. Redemption for Larin was not to come through a bullet or a knife, but through a confrontation with his own despised world. He took out his satellite phone, a small gray device that looked alien and cumbersome in his hands. This call was the last thing that connected him to the world of city dwellers. And he always put off this moment until the last possible moment. He dialed Lieutenant Ryabinin's number. He was probably somewhere nearby, still trying to figure out the lost tracks at the winter hut. Ryabinin? Voron's voice was even, without a hint of emotion, as if he were reporting the weather. Found, Larin. Location? Lysaya Sopka, old hunting lodge. He's immobilized. Wait for the helicopter. You won't get to him on foot before he stiffens. I need you to send a team for him. He's alive and tied up. I brought him to your world. The rest is your job. Voron didn't wait for a response, didn't listen to the operative's stunned, shrill questions. He cut the connection and put the phone back in his backpack. The Raven turned to Tenna, who was waiting patiently. Leica stood up, her golden eyes fixed on her master. Tenna, he commanded, guard him, from wild animals, from his attempts, until the first helicopters arrive. No one is to touch him. He is the property of the city. Shadow made a quiet, understanding sound, returned to her place at the roots, and laid her head on her paws. But her posture was that of a lurking, deadly guard. Raven nodded to her, and there was more trust and understanding in that nod than in any conversation with a human. He hoisted his backpack onto his shoulders. The game was over. Order restored. Now all that remained was to withstand the invasion of the alien, urban world that he himself had just summoned. He moved away, dissolving into the thickening twilight of the taiga, leaving the master, weighed down by the trunk, alone with his fear of the law. The helicopters arrived with the first grey light of dawn, disturbing the peace of the mountain valley with a din and bustle foreign to this place. It was the invasion of the city. Clumsy, noisy,
and full of the undisguised superiority of technology over silent craftsmanship. 2 aircraft arrived, one to transport Laren and the cedar trunk, which served as irrefutable evidence, and the second filled with operatives, criminologists, and even a couple of officials in overly clean camouflage who had come to personally witness the capture. They disembarked from the helicopter like paratroopers, their faces worn out from the night chase and excited by the prospect of victory.
Voron waited for them at the edge of the forest, next to the crushed trunk.
Having done his duty, the shadow retreated into the shade of the spruce forest, but kept his eyes on Laren and the strangers who would arrive.
Laren, freed from his restraints, but still pinned down by the trunk, was in a terrible state. His expensive clothes were torn, his face was smeared with dirt and blood, and his eyes were filled with a dead, empty rage. He did not shout or swear, but only looked at Voron with a chilling hatred that suggested that the game was not over for him, even though it had moved to a completely different arena. Lieutenant Ryabinin, pale with excitement and the importance of the moment, jumped up to Voron first. He tried to combine the roles of an official and an admiring student, but without success. Voron! Ivan Andreevich!
He was breathing heavily.
We found him. It's him. Laren. How did you find him?
The map? The call? Ryabinin looked around hastily, searching for those very clues that could be photographed, entered into the report, and presented to his superiors.
The forensic experts had already set to work, clumsily scurrying around the trunk, trying to measure, record, and describe something that had not been created according to their methods.
Their awkwardness, their constant loud conversations on the radio, their fear of wild, uncontrollable nature, caused Raven almost physical revulsion. The map led here. Voron replied calmly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the blades.
He was waiting. I found him. You can see the rest for yourselves.
He nodded toward Laren, who was now silently enduring the examination by the medics.
Colonel Gromov, the head of the local department, who had flown in personally for such a major victory, pushed Ryabinin aside and approached Raven with an ingratiating but demanding smile.
Ivan Andreevich, your contribution is invaluable.
But now we need details.
All the details. Those marks on the tree. What are they? How are they connected to the other victims?
Voron was taken aside for a brief, informal interrogation, which was essentially an attempt by Gromov to extract material for his report.
Voron answered dryly, sparingly,
giving the police exactly what was needed to legally close the case, and not a word more. He explained that the marks were an old, long-forgotten Taiga code. He pointed to the stone at the first mine and the feather at the pass, but categorically refused to decipher them completely. "It's his signature, Colonel," said Voron, looking Gromov straight in the eye. "His philosophy. He killed those he considered predators who disrupted the balance. I understood his logic, and found him." "You have enough corpses, a lighter with a coat of arms, and the fact that he was stuck under the barrel for the trial."
The marks are his personal language. They are not for city protocols.
The police, of course, were delighted. They had caught the most wanted criminal in the region, a rich, influential poacher who killed out of a sense of superiority, hiding behind ideas of justice. They had physical evidence, Laren crushed by the barrel. For them, This was more than enough.
They believed they had found a simple key. A rich psychopath playing at being a hunter. None of them tried to understand the complexity of the game, the subtlety of the codes, the twisted but consistent logic that drove the killer. They did not want to understand that Larin had lost not to the law, but to the Taiga code, which proved too complex for him.
The police hastily began to prepare Larin for evacuation, securing him on a stretcher and preparing to lift him with a winch, ignoring his quiet but hateful words.
Voron stood with his arms crossed over his chest and watched this spectacle, which was foreign to him. He felt his skin, his lungs, his world covered with a layer of city, protocol dust. He didn't need their gratitude, their recognition, their medal. It was enough for him that the balance disturbed by Larina had been restored. He had done his job, and now he couldn't wait to get rid of all this noise.
The police didn't know the main thing, and Voron wasn't going to tell them. The master had been caught not because of his tracks, but because of his mistake. A tree fungus that didn't belong there. This fact, revealing his outsider status and arrogance, was the key to his psychology, but it was completely useless to the city court. Voron kept this small, bitter secret to himself as the last personal mark in this game. When Larin was finally attached to the winch and began to be lifted up to the helicopter, his eyes met Raven's and flashed for a moment. It was a silent promise, a silent challenge, even from there. In the clutches of the system, Larin was trying to maintain his superiority. But Raven just looked away. He wasn't looking at the master, but at the tops of the cedars, at the gray but clear sky. Voron hoisted his backpack, adjusted his hat, nodded to Tenna, and began to quickly, almost imperceptibly, retreat into the thicket. Ryabinin tried to call after him. "Ivan Andreevich, we'll give you a ride. We need to fill out the paperwork." But Voron did not turn around. He was already where protocols did not apply and helicopters were not needed. He was returning to himself. He had restored order, but his world remained the same, and that was his only and greatest reward. He left, leaving behind the hustle and bustle, the noise and judgments, and felt the Taiga finally breathe slowly and heavily again. The noise of the helicopters had long since died down, and with it, the last dirty trace of the city that had invaded the mountain valley had disappeared. Raven returned to himself slowly, allowing his body to regain its lost balance. He did not rush or hurry. His path was now not a pursuit, but a return. The shadow walked ahead, its movements soft and silent, and its presence was the only thing Raven recognized as something constant and unchanging in the world. They reached the winter hut when the sun had almost disappeared, painting the sky above the tops of the fir trees in disturbing crimson tones. Raven did not light a large fire, only a small, quiet hearth that provided enough heat to cook food and enough light to think. He sat on a stump of an old log, holding his knife in his hands, the very one that had been with him during the fight. He slowly and methodically cleaned the blade of the remains of earth, resin, and someone else's blood. This process was not just a daily routine for him, but a kind of meditation, a way to erase the traces of someone else's distorted life, which had temporarily polluted his own world. As he worked, he thought about Larin. Larin, with his absolute animalistic confidence in his right to kill, was a reflection of that part of Voron's soul that had long since faded into the shadows. The part that knew the value of balance and was ready to enforce it with an iron will. But Larin had crossed the line, turning philosophy into a sadistic game, into the enjoyment of superiority. And Voron, by catching him, proved that his own code,
The Taiga Code stood on the border between necessity and arbitrariness.
The game was over. Laren went to the city to face the long, slow trial he so despised. For him, it was a true punishment. To be deprived of the Taiga, to be locked up in a system where his power was worthless and his code was nothing but a sign of madness. Voron did not become an executioner. He became the guardian of the border. Having finished sharpening the knife, Raven felt the need for one last gesture. He left the winter hut. Shadow followed him, and he headed for an old, mighty cedar tree standing a dozen steps away. This cedar tree had witnessed his loneliness and was the silent keeper of his personal secrets. He took out his knife and slowly, with carefully measured force, made one last mark on its rough bark.
It was not the complex forest code he had used to communicate with Laren. It was a simple, pure symbol that had been used by his ancestors. Crossed lines forming a closed circle. A symbol of the completion of a cycle, restored balance, and newly found peace. It was not a message to Laren, who would never read this language again. It was a message to Taiga and to himself. The Raven ran his fingers over the notch, feeling the rough bark and the fresh, resin-scented cut. He left this mark not for anyone to find, but to mark the end of this hunt. The game was over, but the hunt continued. Not the hunt for a man, but the hunt for truth, for meaning, for the balance that constantly eludes us in this world. He understood that his struggle would never end, because there would always be those who, like Laren, would consider themselves above nature, or above human law. And there must always be someone to guard this boundary, someone who is ready to enter the game, decipher the code, and catch the sick individual. He was not a hero, not a detective in the urban sense of the word. He was just a part of this wild, rebellious place. Raven, a mediator between the world of man and the world of nature. There was no happiness or peace in his life in the usual sense. There was only constant, intense work to maintain a fragile order. And that was his redemption. He returned to the fire, sat down, and Shadow immediately pressed herself against his legs, her warmth a quiet, living comfort. Raven tossed a few cedar branches into the fire. The fire hissed, throwing up a shower of sparks. He listened to the silence. It was not emptiness, but a complete, multi-layered silence, filled with the rustle of the wind in the pine needles, the distant hooting of an owl, and the beating of his own heart. In this silence, there was no lie, no false pride, no foreign philosophy. There was only conscious truth. Laren had been caught, but there would be many more Larens. And somewhere far away, hundreds of miles from here, a new tree fungus was already growing, or a roadside stone was lying in wait for its sign. But that would be a new game, one that Raven would meet with the same cold, honest gaze. He knew that his place was here, and this knowledge was his only quiet consolation. The end.